All right, here we go. Welcome, everyone. We're so happy to have you here as we talk about Yellowbud Hickory today. Um, there we go. Again, I'm Emily Torty with Appalachian Sustainable Development. I just want to nod to the fact that this webinar is produced with funding provided by the Edwards Mother Earth Foundation. So thanks to those great people. You can find Stesha and I at our little names here at asdevelop.org. And she's going to be dropping lots of links in the chat today as we go along to clue you into some really cool resources and things that Eric and Jesse may mention. But here's where we're headed. We'll be here for an hour and a half together. So thank you for joining us on this Friday, the 13th. I hope we're all in a spooky mood and that we can get some mileage out of that. So here's where we're headed. We are going to do our little welcome blurbs. If you have listened to any of these other webinars, it's the ASD intro info is the same. So you can like press pause for 8 minutes and go do something else. If you haven't, stick around. I'd like to tell you about what we get up to. And then we will head into our introducing our guests and having them present. And then we have basically a full hour of Q&A that is the meat of this program. So the first half of that is kind of low-hanging fruit of questions that have been submitted ahead of time or that we know will come up. So we're going to go ahead and cover them. And then the second half is live Q&A. So just a reminder, we are recording. This will upload to YouTube in a couple weeks. We're about to upload all 3 of the sessions that we've recorded so far this year. So keep an eye out for those. You can subscribe to the YouTube channel, and then you get like a little notification when they get uploaded. If you are new to Zoom, just a few things about it. Don't worry if as an attendee, you are muted and your camera is off. So it doesn't matter where you are, what you're doing, how loud your background is, what's going on. Don't worry about all that because you're basically invisible, but you're here in our hearts. We know you're here. We appreciate you. If you need closed captioning, the little CC button is great because especially if you're somewhere loud, it'll produce captions for you of what's being said. So that's a useful tool. We have all these functions here. We just talked about closed captioning. The Q&A is where we will be living most of the time with our conversation today. So if you have questions, like anytime while anyone's speaking today, if you have questions, go to the Q&A and pop it up, and we'll get to that when we can in the second half of the program. In that second half, if you want to like ask a question live, you can do a little raise hand by clicking that, and we can unmute you, and you can ask your question with your beautiful voice. Also, the chat feature is enabled. It's mostly just for actual chatting. So if you are putting questions in there, Stesha, if she sees them, she'll move them over to the Q&A. But just a reminder, really use that Q&A feature. All right, quick spiel about ASD. Our mission is to build a thriving regional food and ag system that creates healthy communities, respects the planet, and cultivates profitable opportunities for Appalachians. So who are we? We've been around since 95. We're coming up on our 30-year birthday, which is pretty exciting. Our work falls into 5 key areas: workforce development, agriculture education, food access, economic development, and resource conservation. So agroforestry, where Stesha and I live in the organization, even though we cross-pollinate a lot with everyone else, we're like this little corner. So ASD gets up to all kinds of really interesting work. And although we have a large coverage area that's growing all the time, we really are focused in what is considered Central Appalachia. We've got kind of a 12 county focus that works specifically with our food hub, which does a ton of work all throughout Southwestern Virginia. So check that out if that's interesting to you. We really believe that agriculture has the power to transform our area and that it can help solve food access, employment, and poverty issues that our region's facing. Where we are, 1 in 8 families are insecure or food insecure. Numbers of farms and farmland acreage are in decline. And we have some of the highest rates of poverty, hunger, and employment in the nation. And so here's some of the ways that we're leading the way. We have sold and distributed $40 million in produce for regional farmers, 150,000 pounds of food grown by new gardeners that we're helping to train. More than 80 raised beds have been installed and managed at schools and clubs. We've helped to preserve over 5,000 acres of farmland and helped to create over 300 new farm startups by supporting them with training and resources. And our food hub is a huge piece of what we do, and we've distributed over 7 million pounds of local and regional food to area food pantries. So basically, we're just crushing it. Um, we are, yeah, thanks for chuckling. We're building a destination agricultural campus to support all of the different stuff that we talked about. We're going to have a big agroforestry sector of it. We're installing an agroforestry nursery there, which is really exciting. And we just can, I guess my Giving Tuesday link is still there. You can give anytime, but we did have a $40,000 match for Giving Tuesday, and we actually raised, I think, just over $75,000. So it's very, very exciting. So thank you to everybody who helped out. If you want to learn more about us, you can go to the programs section of the website, hit on agroforestry. We are working with 3 existing funding programs right now: the Expanding Agroforestry Project, led by the Nature Conservancy, the Catalyzing Agroforestry Grant Program, and the Assets Grant Program. So those are all great opportunities for you to get agroforestry practices supported on your landscape. Also, this is Stesh's wheelhouse, the agroforestry trainings for natural resources professionals. If you are someone who works with landowners a lot and you're looking to expand your agroforestry knowledge, you can visit learnagroforestry.com. There are some free courses, there are some paid courses, and we do inline and online and in-person trainings through those. And lastly, our Appalachian Harvest Herb Hub. If you are in Southwestern Virginia, we have this shared use facility that provides trainings, cost share, processing, and marketing for folks to be able to support their herb growing business, and also help them access larger buyers that they might not be able to access on their own. Please join us on Monday if you get a chance. This will be our last Ask an Agroforester of the season. I'm really happy to be discussing Yellowbud today because it feeds so nicely into this nut cooperative session. But we've got Justin Holt from the Asheville Nuttery, Jeff Peastrick from New York Tree Crops Alliance, and Don English from Keystone Tree Crops Cooperative coming up. So that should be a really great conversation Monday, and we hope to see you there. All right, before we do anything else, we have to administer this poll to, here we go, to find out who is in attendance today. Please answer. This actually really helps us with our metrics tracking and helps us like prove that we're reaching certain targeted audiences. So we appreciate your participation. And while y'all are doing that, I am going to read some bios. So first of all, thank you both for being here. I'm so excited to hear more from you. Just a like quick intro. Eric Cornell is an emissary of the trees, heeding their call back to a more abundant future. Inspired by their generosity, he is compelled by their beauty and the tangibility of a healthier, more peaceful society under their boughs. Blending skills from his winding life path through computer science, massage therapy, yoga, and Ayurveda, Eric approaches this work with curiosity and playfulness, which is just a lovely bio for a lovely person. Jesse Marksohn did not give me a bio, so I made 3 bullet points up. You can tell me if you think these are right or not. But from what I know of you, these are like the 3 things that came up for me right away. Is that Jesse?
Fair enough.
Jesse is a student of the earth, someone that in conversation with him, I feel like he's just always out, like learning, observing, really interacting, and just being super present with it. And it seems like that's where so much of his knowledge is coming from. He's also self-taught, like a lot of the folks we feature, with less of a like super formal educational background, but like really a hands in the soil background. And also just an incredibly kind human being. I met Jesse a few months ago at the Northern Nut Growers Association when I was like squeezing in late to, like I had a long travel day and I was like getting in late and managed to like sneak a spot next to him. And I'm so glad I did because we struck up a friendship. I got to meet Eric. It's been awesome. So thank you both so much. And let's see where we're at with our poll. Okay. So we've got about 12 farmers, just about as many natural resources professionals, a few researchers, about half are just interested individuals, not just, about half are interested individuals, and then a couple students and a couple others. So what we'd love to ask y'all to do is just enter in the chat, maybe like where you're located and what you're up to. And in terms of what people are growing, We've got a couple folks that are not growing anything. We've got, oh, I could share the results here and everyone could see this. That's better. Um, some folks in annuals, some folks in commodity crops, a lot of people in perennials, 21 or 72% of people are in tree crops that are here today. That's awesome. And look, we even have 4 Yellowbud Hickory growers in the audience. So that's exciting. All right, I'm going to stop sharing that now and I'm going to stop talking so that you can hear the folks that you're here to hear. That was a lot of hears that
Here are the folks that are here for
you're
you to
here to
hear.
hear.
You're here.
Here, here.
Um,
Okay.
yeah, I'm gonna start to share my free flowy photo folder. It's a lot of F's.
We're all about the
Um,
alliteration.
yeah, I am. Can you all see this okay? Just a little initial
It'll be full
aerial.
screen
Ah,
now.
Yeah, I think this is their full
Okay,
screen because it's just showing the photos.
cool.
Awesome. So while you guys get to see some drone photography of the nursery, I'm just going to share a little bit about what brings us to this work, more from a philosophical or ethics-driven place, which I think is kind of underpinned by our belief that humans are a keystone species, or can be. Lila June speaks on this really eloquently, but just that the greatest pernicious falsehood that our culture believes is that we're a parasite on the land, and really that can be super limiting or play the role when that's some part of your self-image. And so to bring that all together, we kind of come to this as we're really seeking food security through ecological restoration. And to bring it just to the ground where we've started, that's taking a look at our nursery. That was more of an aerial view, and this is just some of the parents that are in the maybe 3.5 acres of primarily perennial staple crops and cropping systems, mostly with fruit, nut, and pod bearing species. There's a lot of other species that we work with kind of dabbling on, but there's 6 species that we have more of a trying to breed with and invite into a bigger place on our landscape.
And just for scale, those rows are an average of about 450 feet long. And so the scheme of the nursery is that it's an alley crop of a mostly chestnut, persimmon, mulberry, and hickory and honey locust orchard.
Yeah. And the way that thank you for adding that. The way that we do our nursery, just in a really quick run through, uh, I guess a picture that I don't have here is using a deep spader, but we have a high crop tractor that can power a deep spader that can convert lawn into nursery bed pretty quickly. We'll go through and we'll spade one of these 4 foot wide, 450-foot long sections once, wait a couple weeks, hit it again if we're converting from lawn. Ideally, we'll do a cover crop the year earlier, but that doesn't always happen. And then we run behind essentially after the second deep spade while the soil is still moist, and we broadcast. We don't do any kind of really specific grids or anything like that. We'll just broadcast and then fix it up if we feel like there's too much density in one area, but don't get too caught up in that. And then this is a modified manure spreader, got a little lift on the back, and that the second we broadcast the seeds in a row, we will put a few inches of wood chips, partially composted wood chips on each of these rows. And then once they start to emerge, I love this picture so much. Um, we use the urinator, or a tank that we fill with a ratio of about 1 part urine to 3 part human urine from the good people of Brattleboro. Thank you, Rich Earth Institute. didn't give you that link, but they're a really incredible nonprofit.
So 30, like approximately a 33 percent rate, or yeah, concentration of urine with diluted in water.
And for anyone else replicating that, we'd probably recommend a less hot, like more water, less pee mix. But the fact that we put, 3-4 inches of wood chips all over those seeds and then put it into that, it holds it quite a bit. And so this same tank is how we also applied our inoculum. So it's basically the nutrient cycling of our farm is pretty much all wood chips, human urine, and inoculum. And so we can just use a soluble inoculum. We used endo-ecto soluble max from micoapply. Would love to do more of a personal tailored version, but that's maybe for another conversation. And that's one of the few inoculums that's worked really well for us. Short video of showing as they emerge, seedlings emerge, they get feed in and inoculated, preferably in the other order, inoculated and then feed in. And you really want to do this preferably right after.
Height.
Oh,
Some of
I guess I'm
these.
talking in here.
Admiring the persimmon seedlings.
Yeah. Preferably right before and right after rain. You can't always time it like that, but that's a really great way to do it. And won't spend too much time on this, but just a little bit of a infographic from the Rich Earth Institute showing the diverse nutrient composition of our liquid gold. Kind of just a beautiful way, just as everyone knows that we exhale what is their what plant beings or photosynthesizing beings inhale. Another aspect of that symbiosis is that our waste is really nutritious for them. And then once they have grown for a little while, I wish I could mute this. Maybe I could just turn this off. Once the seedlings have grown for generally 1 or 2 seasons, this is this October, I guess, after second season of growth. We use a Lundabee tree lifter. We found one in Western New York that we refurbished for much cheaper, and then that's what they look like. Hi, Gina. And our nursery is quite an ecosystem. Sometimes for the beautiful and easier, well, it's always for the more beautiful, but sometimes in the more challenging aspects. But because we've had really high levels of voles due to our diversity and messiness, we get some really beautiful predators like bobcats and blue herons that eat the voles, also some red foxes, and I guess those are maybe our main vole predators. That is a video that it's not National Geographic, despite how beautiful it is. That was a video that Eric spent like 30 minutes watching this beautiful blue heron to be able to get. Okay, that's a little bit about our nursery from the more production angle once the seeds are on farm. I'm gonna pivot a little bit into some of our TreeSearch, which is kind of a combination of really incredible archival work that Eric primarily does, networking that we both do, and to be able to find the seed stock that we have. So we have a lot of high standards for ourselves. Our nursery, we don't use any herbicides, pesticides, or synthetic fertilizers. And in terms of our seed, we try to source most of it ourselves, not just understanding who the mother trees are, but also making sure that they have really exceptional expressions. So this is an oak tree. I'm going to go through just maybe a couple pictures of each of the 6 main genera that we focus on. oak, chestnut, hickory, mulberry, persimmon, honey locust. So this is one that we call Midmo 1, which has really beautiful large acorns. She is a bur oak. And I guess just to back up for a second, the reason why we focus on these species is really in that pursuit of food security through ecological restoration, we're just, we know we can't do intensive breeding projects on everything, but we want species that have really high, strong historical significance as staple foods, have high biodiversity that they attract, have high capacity to build soil while increasing carry capacity. These aren't the only plants that kind of meet those three objectives or 3 or 4 objectives, but that's just a little bit of an overlay of how we've come to focus on some of these species. So low tannin, bur oak, many other, go for it.
I was just gonna say, don't worry, we're gonna get to Yellowbud. It's just really hard to not share all of these other things.
Yeah,
It's great. You guys are doing great.
thank you. This is a tree that we tell the story of often, a chestnut tree hybrid, complex hybrid, likely Chinese and American genetics. And, many trees like cultivar chestnuts can't quite even keep up with producing over 150 pounds of chestnuts a year, still really great trees. But this tree, which is 27 years old now, which we call Tree of the North, which is a little bit of a misnomer because I think she could also do really well in the South, but produces over 300 pounds annually. And little bit of some pictures, even though it's sideways, showing a little bit of the more average size of some of our seedlings that we offer through our website, yellowbud.farm. And just kind of going through, I guess, right now, the motions of we find the seed, we find incredible trees, we observe them for preferably at least 3 years. We grow a lot of our seedlings out in the ways that we showed you. And then we are building relationships with a ton of different farms, designer practitioners, conservation districts, which hopefully we'll talk about in a little bit. So this is Bread Tree Farms, one of our close partners that we do a lot of co-designing with, as well as they do scaled seedling trials that double as production orchards, and we kind of collaborate on some of the observational protocols and breeding objectives there. It's in Washington County, New York, beautiful hillside. In terms of honey locust, mulberry, and persimmon, these can and have been human food for a long time, but some of the more accessible or more transformative applications, at least in our current agricultural paradigm, is with feeding animals that we plan to become our food at some point. So this is just a really incredible honey locust, grafted honey locust. Actually has 2 grafts. You can see that this right, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the right branch doesn't have any pods. The larger left branch has a ton. And this was just part of some of the TreeSearch of, finding all the archival stuff and then reaching out to these people, getting permission on their sites, assessing their trees and the characteristics and consistent heavy bearing and so on, and then start to save seed. And in the case of honey locust and mulberry and persimmon, storytell with the food part of that when the seeds themselves are not necessarily the food. So these are some of the just really high sugar, more consistent heavy bearing, though most honey locusts are biennial, really delicious floral honey banana flavored yums. That's the botanical term. So mulberry, we primarily advocate for pigs and chickens. And so this is just a local mulberry that seemed pretty consistently heavy bearing. Doesn't have the longest season, but just again going through that storytelling of how we just aggregate as many near and far trees in these species that are really exceptional, and then assess them ourselves and breed from there. This is just a beautiful leaf of a morphologically pure Morus rubra, because that is also another part for more on the multifunctional conservation side of some of the work we're doing, aggregating as many morphologically pure Morus rubra to be offering, given that there's no nurseries to our knowledge at this point that actually offer pure Morus rubra or red mulberry, native red mulberry. Yes. Yes. I'll go through this a little bit quicker. Mulberry has a beautiful aspect of just not only, the leaves themselves, according to an author friend of ours, Eric Tonesmeyer, says that they're top 10 most nutritious vegetable in the world, leaves of mulberry. And so we're doing testing both for flavor and for texture, as well as then sending these in for nutritional samples, which will be starting next spring, of the maybe 60 to 70 individuals that we have here. That picture kind of came out of the later part of this, but quickly going to run through a couple persimmon pictures just from Don Compton's orchard, Proc. Again, this is all just a repetitive cycle of finding beautiful trees and then being as kind to them as we can, and then offering them to the world.
So those are second-year persimmon seedlings, and that was on in August.
With our good
How tall
friend,
are you? About 6 foot.
about 6 foot, our good friend Michael Fernandez at the Bennington County Conservation District, who's one of our partners, along with Jennifer Byrne at the White River Conservation
You
District,
might want to get to Yellowbud stuff.
and Lionel Shute in the Sullivan County Conservation District. So I can just, we could either give an overview of some of the common questions of Yellowbud, but was thinking maybe I was just sharing some of the other species that I figured we might not be able to get into in the Q&A, but now happy to pass it over to whoever has questions about Yellowbud Hickory.
Yeah, so thank you guys so much. And I appreciate taking a little time to see more of the scope of what y'all are doing, because I know that even though like Yellowbud is like your flagship and the namesake at this point, like I know that you guys are doing so much work. So it is cool to see all the little bits. So before we get into the Q&A, we have our little like quick fire fun questions. And one that I like to ask, I never get sick of asking it, is what was the last song that was stuck in your head?
The last song that was stuck in my head. I Am by Satsang.
Oh, okay.
Satsang. It's a really good song.
Nice.
That's such a good question. I'll come back to this. I'll
Yeah.
just non sequitur into it in a few minutes.
I like it. And then is there like what's your favorite like farm tool that you might not think of as a farm tool? Like maybe, like not like a broad fork or a spade, but like what's, like as someone once answered like my phone, because that's where I take all my notes and do like project management. I suspect your answers will be different, but what are the like less tooly tools?
Farm tool. Less tooly tools.
This not necessarily farm related, but wire cutters for nut extraction works really, really well.
Nice.
Good one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like using pruners for things that aren't normally used as pruners, like cutting and cross sections of nuts and stuff like that.
So
But that is
nut cutting
that's a
related.
yeah, both are nut cutting related, I guess. But that is a farm tool, but used for maybe a less common purpose.
Hmm.
No, those are fair answers. Those are on brand.
Okay. Yeah, definitely.
So we're gonna talk all things Yellowbud in a second. I'm gonna do one more sort of like overviewy question based on, conversation we had before this. But really, I think the question that I want to ask is like, what is at stake? Y'all have put like you're putting your lives into this, right? Um, and I think people don't always realize like what, either what we have to gain or what we have to lose if people aren't carrying this work forward. So I would love to just hear a little bit about that from you before we talk about like years to bearing and that kind of stuff.
Mhm. I mean, I think what we have to lose is so commonly focused on well, it depends on what spheres you're in, because I don't know how much the general public understands the like immense fragility of our food systems, but I think I personally like to focus more on what we have to gain,
Mhm.
understanding kind of the irony of Eden, or like just how close we are to a incredibly abundant landscape overflowing with extremely delicious food in such a diverse way, and how that shifts our cultural norms and our nervous systems by feeling held by a landscape that we're in, deep relationship and co-knowing with.
Hmm. Yeah, a lot of what informs my passion for the work is more on the famine prevention side of things and just recognizing how fragile our food and energy and supply chains are, and also recognizing that um, our forests are already full of oaks and hickories and walnuts, and that these trees, when planted and tended, do tend to come into bearing quicker than trees that we don't plant. It's oftentimes that it's kind of a joke there, but a lot of people hesitate to plant trees or are maybe discouraged from perennial systems because of the gap to the harvests. But I think that oftentimes the trees bear sooner than what might be commonly um, thought of when they're tended and when they're not just on marginal land, and when they are fertilized, or if we know what inoculants or living soil associates help them get what they need and reduce their um, whatever their
Limiting
limiting
factors.
factors are. Yeah.
Mm, lovely. And I feel like that's a really good segue to just talking about like do you want to give kind of a general rundown, just tree characteristics, years to bearing, uh, productivity, nutritional composition, like why you're so excited about this, or this tree in particular. Yeah, I'll let y'all take that
Yeah.
because I know you have a lot to say.
Yeah. I guess, well, we could just stay on this photo for a second this is I also have some pictures here, but if you're or some in in the flesh examples. So this is just an average cross section
So we're
of
screen sharing. So
oh, can you see my screen as well?
Let me see if I can just put it
We
on.
I can just do it verbally, and we could do that later.
Okay, yeah, we can pop those up there.
Um, so the value of Yellowbud Hickory is hard to explain the expansiveness of it in a short statement, because the cultural neglect that's been assigned to this species for one reason or another is just really significant. The USDA website says that they're inedible to humans and almost, not cared about by wildlife, which is completely false. There's just a lot of information that seems like it's just been passed on without any interaction. But there's a few different ways you can approach this. I mean, in terms of productivity per acre, why would we not choose a native long-lived tree that doesn't require tillage and herbicide and synthetic fertilizer when it's in our collective, ourselves and folks like Alex Tankey and maybe most significantly Sam Thayer, people that have been in this kind of evaluation, assessment of viability stage with us. It seems pretty clear that these can have the potential to outproduce canola and sunflower in terms of yield per acre. And the nutritional profile, which I can just put up a screen with way too many words that you don't really have to focus on. But the nutritional profile is like it's within a range that overlaps almost exactly with olive, really high in oleic acid. When people talk about seed oils, I mean they're often not talking about hickory nut oils or other perennial nut oils, but it is a seed, but the nutritional composition and smoke point are significantly healthier, and the ways that we can transform them is really accessible compared to a lot of other agricultural contexts. It's not cheap. Equipment is still expensive, but for, $12,000, you can get an oil press. I guess I don't know what it's like right at this moment, but a year or two ago, it was $12,000-ish to get it shipped here. And we use a cold screw expeller press. And it's not that complicated, especially when a lot of these systems, thank you, Sam Thayer, has been demystified, especially by people that are have an ethos of like open source beliefs and values. And so that last picture that I had, which was comparing different Carya species and their fatty acid profile, this is one of the samples. I think that was from a paper in, was it 1969 or something like that? To our knowledge, this is that was the last time that this species was tested for nutritional content. But pretty good omega-3 to omega-6 fatty acid ratio, which is, I don't know if this can highlight. Nope.
Just zoom in a little bit on thanks.
Oh, here.
Yeah, that's great.
So you can see monounsaturated that's correlating to the oleic acid. And on that previous slide from 1969, 14 different cordiformis samples were tested, and the oleic acid ranged from 61% to over 85%. And so the batch that we tested was about 70. So it was about mid-range. And this kind of shows that in the TreeSearch and exploration is that's a pretty significant range in a very healthful oil. In propagation, we're going to try to find trees that have on the higher range of the oleic acid, which is healthful for humans and for feeding livestock. I was able to find some references to oleic acid being the most digestible of all the plant-based fatty acids, and that it actually increases the absorption and the utilization of the other fatty acids, specifically saturated fats in ruminant diets, which is really interesting.
And ultimately, we're at this like just incredibly young phase of so many really high potential. Eric is talking about the potential in silvopasture, and besides a couple anecdotes of people observing cattle eating the nuts, we don't know what percentage of their diet or what breeds or microbiome is helpful for them to consume that if they can at whatever concentrations. But really, I think the word that we like to use often is like we're in pursuit. We're in pursuit in silvopasture to be eliminating off-farm feed. We're in pursuit with Yellowbud to be creating more incredibly resilient fat of the land that has an incredibly wide geographic range, you know. So we don't claim to understand all of the different nooks and crannies of a lot of this, but we're just in pursuit to learn more and assess what the value is and bring these high value possibilities further. And I guess to speak to the range that I mentioned too, which is one of the beautiful accolades, and then maybe I'll talk about kernel to shell ratio, but the range of this species is, you know, Tampa Bay, Florida, there's hickories that are bearing and going all, which I don't know if that's zone 8 or 9, all the way to areas of northern Minnesota that get down to -55 every year. Both places have, you know, some genetically diverse populations of resilient trees growing there. And so, and on top of that, you know, some of our best selections from doing this for a handful of years at this point, we've seen them in drought, we've seen them in flood, we've seen them in late frost. You know, we had a late frost up in the Northeast spring, what was it, March 18th, 23. And yeah, I mean, a handful of our best trees just, you know, the leaderboards change every year, but they just produced a really healthy crop, which is just so fun to be able to observe all of these trees year in and year out and just understand their personalities and capacities. Yeah. And then kernel to shell ratio is a helpful thing. And then maybe I could jump back to opening it up to questions. I'm sure I missed a couple things of part of how virtuous they are. But kernel to shell ratio is significant because really it just means it's like more pushing towards this like accessibility. You know, if you're trying to press, I love hazelnuts, don't get me wrong, this is not a dig towards hazelnuts, but if you're trying to press hazelnuts, black walnuts, other nut oils, or you need to do a shell separation step. You often need to size sort, which is a whole piece of equipment, differing prices at differing scales, and then you need to be able to crack them and then aspirate or use a weight table to separate a certain percentage of the shell before you can then crush and then press. And the beauty of Yellowbud is that it has this kind of Goldilocks zone of kernel to shell ratio, which is, you know, the highest of any in the walnut family, rivaled only by like some of the, you know, newer cultivars of pecan of being usually in the range of 55 to 65% kernel, but some that have been tested over 70% kernel. And so that just means that it has the right amount of tough material. It's also hard to press just pure fat-rich material in these cold screw expeller presses. So it's the right amount of tough material, the right amount of fatty material. And that's just means less cost of equipment, less space to maintain and learn how to use it and so on, which is really beautiful. And I'm going to say one more thing and then pass it back over. We like to use olives as a comparison. It's helpful because they have a really similar fatty acid profile, as we mentioned, but there's different ranges that I've seen, but usually it's in the range of 11 to 30% fat, an olive. And the kernel of Yellowbud Hickory is 75 to 80% fat. And so just the volume that you need to collect in order to get the output of this delicious and nutritious cooking oil and finishing oil is really low compared to a lot of other crops because of their fat density.
Yeah. On that note, I've heard people say anecdotally, and maybe you could help us like visualize this, but I've heard people say like, I'm not going to say the number, let you say it, like X gallons. I have a 5-gallon bucket of Yellowbud and I pressed it to be this volume of oil. You know, like, is there like something like a simple conversion you can think of?
Yeah. I mean, looking at this picture, you can see that there's mostly nuts in husk. And when you have, I'm going to go through a couple of different things. So this is with a volume reduction. When you have fresh in husk nuts to dried husked nuts, it's somewhere between, it's like maybe about 55% or 45% volume reduction.
Mhm.
And then once you have that, but you can, if you're being conservative because there's some loss, you can just say half. Fresh volume to dry out of husk volume is half. And then there is a range, some because there's a range in kernel to shell ratio and so on. We've found some amount of wiggle room there, but 7.5, so like 1 to 7.5. Is that right? 7.5 to 1. 7.5 gallons of dried husked nuts equals 1 gallon of finished oil.
That's amazing
So
because
like
I
a
feel like
five
you can
gallon
like
over three
picture
quarters.
yourself with that much, you know what I mean? It's not, that's great because it's easy to like, okay, like I can, that's achievable to like collect that many nuts and like provide a lot of oil.
Mhm.
Yeah. Sam Thayer says that he can collect the 4 gallons that he consumes in a year with his family in 4 hours, which we kind of corroborate that. It doesn't take him 4 hours to do the whole process, but it's also not very significant for how valuable that staple fat is. And there's a lot of historical precedent as well. I mean, the term hickory comes from Paco hicora, which wasn't where we don't know of it traditionally being done with this species, but with shagbarks, they would crush and boil the nuts and makes an incredibly delicious drink, or if you boil it for, that is called Paco hicora, which I'm probably pronouncing incorrectly. And if you boil it for a longer period of time, the fats really separate and then you can skim them off and they can be stored, at least from the historical evidence that we've seen so far.
Wonderful. Let me ask just a couple like basic questions. So talk about just like years to bearing and like potential productivity, if you would. I know there's a lot of misinformation about all kinds of stuff out there, and maybe next we can talk about that. Some of the nasty rumors out there about Yellowbud hickory.
Yeah, so this is Mirica. I'm pretty sure I got permission uh, to show this photo, but this is one of Sam Thayer's daughters. This was actually, I believe, Rebecca, his youngest daughter's birth tree. And this, about a year and a half ago, this was the only Yellowbud or Caryopcordiformis tree that was intentionally planted with the intentions to consume the nuts for food, process them and consume. And so that's like how, you know, little we know. But this is in zone 4, Wisconsin, I think 4A. And so he planted the tree that was, he said, roughly knee height. And it was 6 years after he planted was when this tree flowered and produced a crop. And so that's pretty different than the 30 I've even seen, like I think 40 years to bearing on forestry websites or USDA and stuff like that. In an area that is significantly colder than us and way colder than, I guess, I'm not sure where all of your listeners are, but yeah, definitely a lot colder than in the southeast. They seem to really, really strongly respond to fertility. They can handle low fertility, but was it J.F. Jones that has that quote? I don't know if you want to share.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah, J. Russell Smith. Yeah.
Oh,
Feed your hickories.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's just
Yeah, I was kind of speaking to that earlier. It's like, yeah, they take too long to bear, but maybe in a not forest competitive, non-fertilized context,
right.
yeah, we really don't even know what the upper limit of productivity is or years to bearing on this because it really hasn't been given a fair shot yet.
Yeah. And if people want to in terms of assessing productivity, it's a long conversation because we have like some data points, and then we have to kind of draw from analogs and make assumptions based on different trees that we have. But if you wanted to go on to uh, our the learn section of our website, there's a tree crop pillar. It's what we call on Yellowbud Hickory that talks a little bit about it. It's probably confusing, but if you have a moment at some point to read through that, there would probably be a lot of more informed questions, maybe clarifying some of that. But a tree that we grow a lot of is a tree that we call Paradise. Average drip line of 45 feet. And not an incredibly large tree, but wildly productive. We've only done like as close to a complete harvest as we could 1 year, but we've observed this tree, taken pictures of her branches. For this last fall was the 5th year. And I think that it's pretty conservative to estimate that this tree produces over 8 gallons a year by herself
Of oil.
of oil. Right, over 500 pounds of nuts a year. She's definitely an outlier, though we have a lot of other trees that are really consistent heavy bearing. And if you're to kind of go through, what Sam Thayer did with some of his, he has a bunch of trees that he tracked, but 3 in particular that he's tracked for, I think, anywhere from 6 to 8 years at this point, and only writes down what he collects and presses. But he estimates by kind of assessing drip line that it's about 42 gallons per acre. But there's a lot of caveats in that. There's the assumption that the drip line, when you have a drip line, when you're measuring a drip line and assuming it's a square and that they're all going to be side by side, that would be a part of the equation that says, oh, this is not very conservative. But if you take the other aspects of his assessments, which are that most of the trees or all the trees are not close to him, hours away, and every time he's going, he sees multiple squirrels in at least 2, I think 2 out of the 3 trees. He said he put a big fat 0 on, I think it was 2 or 3 years of one of the trees that he's made this assessment with, and he's like, all 3 of those years were decent crops. And he just put 0 because he didn't collect any. They were picked clean before he got there, and they dropped, before they dropped. So
Wow.
it's really hard to do good assessments. One of our best hybrid trees in Vermont had a similar thing. This year we went like last week in August, and we're like, okay, are you ready? Are you ready? And then we went like less than a week and a half later or something, 2 nuts on the whole tree. It was like huge crop and just like stripped bare. It's like one of our better seed trees for seed. But
But you
so
guys, I thought the USDA information says that there's no seed dispersal strategy other than gravity.
Yeah.
yeah,
Primary seed dispersal is gravity.
yeah, that makes sense if you never
It's
interact.
a diff for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, amazing. What other like big, I mean, we talked a little bit about, we've talked about seed dispersal now. Any other like big misinformation, like things you want to just sort of like dispel while you have the platform?
Uh, yeah, we talked about years to bearing. Here, I guess age, sometimes they say that well, I don't know if this is a myth I'm dispelling because I don't know
It's
how old.
the shortest lived of all hickories.
Yeah.
We've seen some really, really oldies. What is this? I think it's more than 150 years old, but
Yeah,
this is probably 250, 300. It's hard to even say. If you, when you're standing up in the tree, you can see above my head, it's like three or four mature sized trees like coming off of that. I think it's approaching 5 foot DBH.
yeah.
Wow.
It might even be over 5 foot DBH.
Someone just asked in the chat, they said, so what happened to all the nuts? I'll let you guys.
Oh, the for the tree that we collected from,
Mhm.
it got chipmunk, squirrel cached
Yeah.
in incredible pace. The thing is, so there are a lot of hybrids. So there's hybrids between Caryocortiformis, the yellowbud,
So we could just
and
go quickly go over this. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Carya ovata, the shagbark, and there's other hybrids with Cortiformis, but that's one of the primary ones that we focus on with our breeding project. Um,
So So this is pretty just foundational to the work is to the left, you've got just Caryocortiformis, Yellowbud bitternut hickory, and then to the right, far right, you have just the typical shagbark. You can see thicker shell, but it's got a really delicious sweet kernel. And then in the middle, you've got the hybrid. So this is Cortiformis biovata. So this is called a lanei. So that's the hybrid between yellowbud and shagbark. Thinner shell, intermediate shell, and oftentimes you have low to no astringency. So you've got the sweet kernel of the shagbark, and this is the sweet spot. There is variability in astringency and in shell thickness, but oftentimes they display heterosis or hybrid vigor. So they have like hardiness and productivity and disease resistance, which is really exciting. And this could be just an eating nut. It could be pressed for oil if the kernel to shell ratio Jesse was talking about is, it seems like about 50% above 50% seems to be where the line is drawn for pressing with the current setup based on the German Kernkraft oil presses we're using, thanks to Sam's process. And the hybrid also lends a lot of applications for feeding animals to the tannic nuts. It's interesting that acorns are considered such high wildlife value and just traditional food for livestock, extremely tannic. Same with yellowbud. So it's um, one of the questions is how much tannin can be in the diet if we're really trying to use it as a significant caloric input for feeding animals. So with the lower astringency or no astringency in the hybrids, then that really kind of takes that limitation out of the equation, and we can really um, feed a lot to animals, and they can just be feeding themselves,
right,
utilizing that gravity thing.
right. And one other aspect of what's so beautiful about the hybrids, or I guess Cortiformis, and then bringing the shagbark with together with them is thinking more, I guess, a little reductionistically. If there's like a energy budget for these trees, putting energy into a shell is a lot of, that's a lot of energy they have to put into it, but also into the husk itself. And so we could go through and talk about some of these other hybrids, but many of them have intermediate husks or quite thin husks. There's a range, but they're not as thick as almost any shagbarks. Um, and that's just less work that they have to put into. Oh, that is that's Sears hickory. That is also what we think is an Ovata cordiformis hybrid. Um, oh, here's one that's hybrid that's really thin husk, really thin shell. Um, yeah, the expression in these hybrids is so significantly different, but from a average shagbark to uh, this is not even close to the thinnest shelled hybrid that we have. Um, it's just so much more food. If you have most shags are maybe half the kernel to shell ratio, meaning if you're carrying a 5-gallon bucket to process, you have half the amount of actual food for yourself. Yeah.
Wow. Oh, it's so cool. So before we move on to the questions in the Q&A, can you talk just a little bit about identification and specifically like in these species that are readily hybridizing and just kind of as that relates to, and we talked about this a little bit with Zach and honey locust recently, but just to like sort of like being and like becoming a forest explorer and people like wanting to engage in this work meaningfully and like getting to know a tree and a species. And I don't know, there's a lot wrapped up in that question, and I don't want to take too much time on it, but I do want to give y'all a platform to talk about both ID and then just like the practice of forest exploration.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, if you find the buds, if there's branches that are low enough, and often we say they come in packs. So sometimes there'll be seedlings around a larger tree, and it's helpful to get an indicator. This is a little bit elongated because it was in the spring. Eric took this beautiful photo, but the bright yellow bud, there's no other tree species uh, in the US that has this bright yellow bud. Um, the bark can sometimes be confusing, but there's there's a pretty wide range of morphological expression within bark. Both of these are yellow bud. This one looks a little bit more like Carya glabra, but we can assure you it's definitely Yellowbud. This is a side by side of a little bit younger bark of Yellowbud. It has that kind of uh, ropey, beautiful, veiny type pattern that is, there's one way I described it is that there's not many peaks and troughs that are significant, where in a ash, which is commonly misconstrued for Yellowbud, you can see that they kind of come to, if you were looking at a cross section, look like a little mountain and goes to a deep valley, versus with Yellowbud, they're much shallower. But generally, it's helpful to have a combination of characteristics because, a bunch of different tree species have a wide range of morphology, and so uh, become a squirrel when you're looking under one of the trees, or a chicken, do the chicken scratch, just like rustle around and see if you can find any remnants of nuts. And if the nuts are eggshell thin, that's a really good characteristic. If they're actually falling in this time, if they're bitter and eggshell thin and have a thin husk, that's a pretty good telltale. There's a few other species that can be confusing. Norway maple's bark can be really similar sometimes, but in terms of branching pattern, if you look up, even if it's a tall tree, especially if you have maybe binoculars, but you can usually see from larger branches whether it's opposite or alternate. So if the branches from each node come out on either side of each other or in an alternating pattern along a stem. And so, yeah, ash and Norway maple and all the maples are opposite, and Yellowbud is alternate. Is there anything you want to add to that for ID?
Um, in Appalachia, the tulip poplar could be confused for the young yellow bud bark, and also on the younger trees, you'll notice the splotching of the lichens. That's something that is pretty common on Yellowbud ID. And the Yellowbuds often have a more pronounced root flare than ash trees. So it's kind of like a confluence of these characteristics. It's like even like having obsessed over these trees for like 5 to 7 years, like it's still get thrown a curveball pretty often actually, and do double takes or be like, oh, that's Yellowbud. Oh man, it's an ash. Like it's interesting that they are tricksters in that way.
And it's usually when we're trying to like race each other to an ID.
Yeah.
Because if you actually just spend like a few minutes and find a couple nut samples and like, see if you can find a branch, if you're in an area where there's Carya glabra, Carya tomentosa, if you can find a branch or a twig, it's easy. You know, the yellow bud is just so clear. But finding nut samples is really helpful in those contexts because the nut and husk characteristics are really different, but the barks can really overlap sometimes.
How does hybridization affect the actual yellow bud and as an ID character?
Um, well, there is in hybridization, there's just so many different
Yeah.
morphologies. So this is Sears hickory, which is we're on a countertop made of wood of fallen off leader of this tree. But you can see that it has some yellow. It doesn't have the bud scales like you would have with a shagbark. But in other examples, this is SF1, I believe, one or two. Um, I guess this is during the season, and I didn't have like a good picture in winter, but you see some kind of like weird bud scales on the terminal bud, but not a yellow color. The reality is there's just huge variation in morphology. Uh,
Sure.
Paradise, one of the trees that we were talking about, that's incredibly consistent heavy bearing and low tannin, not completely non-astringent, but uh, she has like a pretty much like a odd looking yellow bud, but is like black. And then her seedlings are like sometimes black, sometimes yellow, sometimes almost purpley, sometimes multiple colors in the bud. If you're Hybrids are really hard to pin down, but the I find that this kind of little bit intermediate husk thickness with the wings, the ridges that go, four ridges that go up, is one of the traits that you can differentiate, but you really need to go through a handful of different traits to kind of, well, I was going to say confirm that it's a hybrid, but ultimately we're still doing guesswork too. We feel pretty confident about most of them, but we're working with lead scientist at the USDA Pecan Breeding Center, Warren Chatwin, that's going to have some test results back for us, I think in spring. So we tested a bunch of our Lanei, the Ovata cordiformis hybrids, as well as what we assume are, brownie eye, pecan, yellowbud hybrids, and also some what we think are pure species.
Interesting. Oh, I okay. We've got to stay on track. We've got 20 minutes left and a bunch of Q&A. So I'm gonna move straight into the audience Q&A because I want to make sure we cover everything. So I think I'm gonna batch a few of these. There's sort of some nursery specific questions together. So one is how often do you apply the micoapply inoculum? Just at planting?
So we've done a few different strategies. Soaking the seed in the concentrate before planting is a really efficient way of doing it. We've also used it as a root dip if we're transplanting trees. Um, but when we used the applicator in season, I think we just applied it once, and I think it was in July. Just like when the trees are like in their root, once they get established and they're kind of hitting their growth spurt, about maybe a month and a half after planting.
Which is
Nice.
not necessarily best practice, just kind of what we've done so far and seen good results from it.
So, okay, Sarah Lynn asks, what software do you use for mapping and planning and managing orchard installation slash input slash maintenance?
We don't.
If
The
any.
answer is yeah, well, we have a drone, so we're able to do nice aerial imagery and then just kind of yeah, just very, very basic 101 Photoshop skills of just being able to like put text boxes on or this or that. Getting more and more familiar with GIS and have friends that are helping us with that. So very soon we hope to have like an actual interactable map with each tree in the orchard being something that has a little profile where we can have images and data, and then also like the nursery beds can be highlighted and input data on a more cohesive map database synthesis thing.
A while ago, I've learned about just with a drone how you can take a better, automated image if you kind of outline the area, and then that can be overlaid onto Google Earth Pro, free software, and then you can just make points. But there's a ton of different tools, and I'm kind of in the process of trying to learn from that, or learn from our friends that are learning and kind of sifting through that. I think the folks at Breadtree would have better answers for you on this specific subject. I know there's also a thread that Steve Gabriel was running recently on a listserv that was on this exact topic.
Yeah, just a lot of pretty inefficient spreadsheets and some aerial imagery.
Can't all have all the strengths, you know.
True.
All right. Do you have any tips for grafting Yellowbud?
Yeah. I'm not really trying to go, on that thread of can't have all the strengths or all the focuses. We're not trying to do production scale for that, but for people doing it at home, think planting, either buying some Yellowbud or Yellowbud hybrids. I wouldn't graft. We're trying to learn more about this, but I wouldn't necessarily graft hybrids onto pure Yellowbud just from anecdotes from the past that we've heard. But it seems like shagbark and pecan are good rootstocks or hybrids if you're trying to graft hybrid to hybrid, or I mean, graft hybrid to either of those rootstocks. But in terms of just some basic tips, this is kind of a whole world that we could go into that I don't know if we should spend too much time on. But wait till you have high temps at the night as well. Wait till June. A lot of people have the hearsay of like, grafting in the same season of apples or other more common fruit. Yeah, don't do that. Wait till preferably a dry week or two that has high nighttime and daytime temps. And you can do a bunch of different types of grafts, but I love whip and tongue when you can line it up right. You can do modified bark or veneer grafts that have worked for me, but really making sure you're in a high temp window where there hasn't been a ton of rain helps it so they don't bleed as much and they focus more on healing that union. But that takes time. So be kind to yourself and expect that you'll have relatively low take for your first year or two.
And make sure to boop, as we say,
I'm gonna get some water.
any sprouts below the graft, because that, even if you have an like impeccable graft, if you let those go for even like a few days or a week, they can just divert the tree's energy and really kill the graft.
Okay. That's a good tip. So, all right. Moving more towards slightly philosophical. I have two from MJ that I'm going to batch together. MJ, hi. Thanks for being here. Why do you think this work hasn't been done before, specifically regarding hickory oil production and acorns as staple starch? And then just the like little companion statement is, I'd like to just add the note that olive oil is a tree crop product and pecan has a robust industry. So what makes oak and hickory different?
I don't know. My general answer to this is like sheer and total cultural neglect and how the process of colonization had immense, not only like just horrifying cultural erasure, but also uh, just a dismissive element to what was feeding people and how they tended the land. And so I don't know. We only have like, I think one or two examples, archaeological examples of people pre-colonially significantly consuming these nuts. I think it was the Corey Village site. It was the most common nut remain in Western New York, but I don't really know. It seems like so promising, but I didn't really think about it until Sam Thayer went through, his own process, and um, highly recommend his books. And that's where I learned that this had a lot of potential.
Here's a range question. Are you guys aware of the historic western range of Caryopodiformis?
I don't know. Do you?
Yeah, the east of the Rockies. I think it went into uh, definitely into Iowa, Nebraska, Missouri, um, perhaps yeah, eastern Oklahoma and Texas. Yeah, part of it is yeah, on its furthest ranges in riparian zones. Once you get to the furthest reaches of the species, it had hickories were extensively taken down for not only fuel wood, but for poles and staves just hundreds of years ago. They were just the original trees were mined for fuel and lumber, and then all of the seedlings were just bundled up by the hundreds and just sent on rail cars because they were such an incredible stock for tool handles and for wagon wheels, and just hickory just had a incredible industrial application, and a lot of these trees at the furthest ranges were just extirpated in that way. So it's hard to know what the true historical range was.
Yeah. Our culture generally has like a perspective that there's like not, doesn't see things through the many various uses that a being might offer. And so when you see something as just board feet and firewood or tool handles or something, it may be hard to understand the other aspects of value. I don't know.
So next question from Don Leroux. You talked about some of the natural hybridization that's happening. Is there like breeder hybridization happening? I rephrased his question a little bit, but
You're you're looking at most of it and we haven't started. There's no intentional hybrids of lanei that I know of. There's seedlings of hybrids that have been found.
Intentional as in the sense of controlled cross.
Mhm.
But in terms of incidental hybridization, just people that have, whether through the Northern Neck Growers Association or some of the USDA stuff way back in the day in the 30s, unintentional crosses just by aggregating hickories together into the same place so that they could just kind of fertilize themselves on their own. Um,
Yeah.
but intentional controlled crosses, yeah, besides pecan and
Oh, right.
work with shagbark and shellbark, or mostly it's just chance hybrids that were found in the forest that were identified and then propagated.
Yeah. I don't know of any F1s. Like major pecan is like a major parent in breeding projects for pecans for a few different reasons, but
Which has
and
Yellowbud's a grandparent, correct?
and it has Yellowbud as a grandparent, or at least has Yellowbud and some shagbark, I think, alleles as well. I think I put a picture somewhere in here of the kind of different morphology of major pecans husks. So there's precedent for understanding why the heterosis or hybrid vigor and potential of doing hybrids, but I don't know anyone intentionally doing it. We're starting to do it as well, but often in the plans that we have right now, we're generally crossing what we assume to be F1 or F2, like, pure, even though species is not as rigid as we make it out to be, like pure shagbark by pure yellowbud, it's often we'll find really exceptional hybrids by really exceptional hybrids and cross them. Generally ones that are thin enough to press, heavy, consistent heavy bearing and low astringency, and we'll cross those together to see what happens when the party starts.
Mm.
But this was one example of a natural hybrid that who knows how old this tree is. Very huge, hard to tell in this picture, but this was uh, in Western New York and is definitely over 200 years old. How old, I don't really know.
Yeah, this is an ancient tree. This is the Lanei type tree. So this was named after the C.C. Laney was the superintendent of the parks, and it was an honorific. It's kind of a strange name, but we've come to like it a lot.
Hmm.
Uh,
Emily, is there a hard cap at 130 or is it possible to go over a little bit? Because I feel like we haven't done that.
Um, I don't have a hard cap. I want to respect y'all's time and Sesha's time, but I can certainly at least finish up the questions that are in the queue now,
Okay.
which I think Sesha says she's good to stay, which I think would take us probably to like 145.
Okay. Great.
Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. Thanks, y'all. So let's see where I just had one. Oh, can you speak to like heavy masting years versus like alternate bearing? What is the kind of patterning for Yellowbud?
Yeah. So the answer that I most commonly give with everything is as either it depends or I don't know. But for the for some of the trees, here's where is it? This is a tree in Vermont, or actually a group of hybrids in Vermont. This one we call SF1. And if my picture was bigger, I could show you some example nuts that we have. I think we were actually staying on the example nuts earlier, but this tree we've observed for this past most recent fall was the third year we've observed. And so, 3 years of a really healthy crop, not quite to the like incredible extent to um paradise, but they're individuals, and often the debate on is it nature, is it nurture, like is it genetics or is it context? Um, it's kind of silly to debate that because it's always both, in my opinion. Here's a situation of a tree that's incredibly unproductive. It's at the base of a pasture in prime ag soil. I often see, hi Tina, one of our collaborators uh, at Northern Forest Foods, often see a lot of cows that hang out right over here. High fertility in prime ag soil, getting all the water that sheds off this field and has produced almost no crop in the like 3 years I've watched this tree versus uh, uh, this tree in high competition. This is one we call Skyrock. Um, Produces pretty, and this is what we believe to be, pure cordiformis. There aren't shagbarks or other hickory species in this area, and is pretty consistent heavy bearing. And we have a bunch of other contexts like that. So it seems like some just have a propensity to offer more seeds, and others much more. Um, Yeah, some much more than others. Yeah, when we were talking about the SF trees, again, they had a, a hard frost where the farm that this is located on had I think a 98 or 99% crop loss. And
in the apple orchard.
in the apple orchard, and these trees produced what seemed like a pretty comparable crop than the year before. So 3 years in a row through flood, drought, and late frost, they've produced pretty well. So it's just it's this kind of speaks to the importance of finding and propagating the trees that are in that realm of much higher resilience and much more um, generous in their offerings.
Okay. So I want to take the opportunity to kind of touch back on since I know we have a little extra time, to touch back on a question that we kind of started earlier but didn't finish is as I'm listening to you talk about all of these like individual trees that you have relationships with and, all these photos of and documentation of like how does that start for you? So this back to the sort of like how did you become like forest like explorers? Like how like are you I feel like as a person who's been like getting to know just the world of trees more and more, it's like my husband jokes about how it's like ruined road trips because I'm constantly like, can we get, like
Ruin. Yeah. Like the
like
most
the shiny
enjoyable
thing.
adult treasure hunt where the bounty is like the most nutritious, delicious food and like altruism.
Well,
Anyway,
I
a
can
little bit of
relate.
a
It is dangerous to be doing tree ID while operating a motor vehicle.
you want to speak to the like some of the archival root work or
Um, to what capacity? Just in
well, she was
general?
just saying like how do we find some of these trees?
Oh yeah. Um, yeah, the annual reports from the Northern Nutgrowers Association, incredible resource. I don't know. I took a permaculture course in 2014 and got introduced to the book Tree Crops, which I'm sure some of the people listening in will have heard about. Which is it is cliche, but it really is like a tremendous like ethnography of like it's a lot of primary source, just information just from J. Russell Smith traveling and just being a prolific correspondent with hundreds, if not thousands, of people on the ground that were growing these trees or exploring, sharing their personal experience. And yeah, and to also just kind of circle back to why hasn't this happened or what has prevented it? Well, there's the element of just, yeah, just the social history of the past few hundred years of cultural erasure and the association with food, or forest products or foods coming from the forest with either poverty or some sort of cultural backwardness, which is really a shame. Because there was obviously a strong reliance and subsistence on these foods. And the people coming from Europe, a lot of them had an association with like products of either chestnuts or going way back in time, hazelnuts and acorns, and before they were culturally erased and taken off out of their original life ways. Um, so there were echoes of that, and um, just subsistence culture in general just has like with modernity and just this illusion of progress and urbanization, people leaving the farm or leaving the rural communities and going to the cities. There's just an association with simple ways and simple living is backwards or something that was something people were escaping. Um,
Can I jump off from there? Or yeah, go.
Oh, so yeah, in terms of like Northern Knuckers Association was established in 1910. Um, this was a kind of a pivotal time. That the first meeting in 1911 was at Cornell University, and John Craig was the dean of the horticulture school, and he was really strong on nusiculture is what he called it, and had a course at Cornell. And he died the following year, and it kind of fell apart after that because he was the one that was really holding that together. And to have nut culture have a firm foothold in a land grant college, with the mandate being um, that they're like proof of concepting, like how do we grow food and how do we support rural livelihood? And for nut culture to kind of lose that opportunity and not really ever recover from that is something that historically was really unfortunate. And then also the USDA did have a CA Reed, was at Beltsville and at the Arlington Experiment Station before that, doing a lot of institutional work on nuts. But it really just never got a foothold, especially after World War II with the Green Revolution and everything. But the TVA is probably the most solid example of like government resources going towards tree crops development. And they had a nursery at the North Dam in Tennessee that was headed up by John Hershey for a few years before he got sick. and they were doing extensive genetics work and breeding, and had a nursery that was producing over 1 million trees a year. And then John Hershey got sick, I think 3 years into that project in 1937, and then it kind of devolved back into more what is considered forestry rather than what we now call agroforestry.
So it seems like, part of what, just jumping off from there, like part of why we do so much exploration is because there's so much to explore. There's so much rich history, as Eric's speaking to. And when you start to sift through the annual reports that, thank you, Eliza Greenman and Taylor Malone, are searchable, you can just search a different species and then see the 400 different results. And oftentimes they would even have their addresses. And then you can go on Google Maps or maybe Street View and then see if you can see grid patterns or if there's trees left over. And you can even then look at the phone book and see if it aligns with the parcel data, call them up or email them, or just if they're not responsive, go and knock on their door and definitely get permission. Don't trespass, because I've never done that. And it's just incredibly exciting. There's just so many beings that are true alive treasures that can transform what our landscape looks like. And just the carrying capacity while being able to, as we've said, like increase biodiversity and increase our ability to build soil all at the same time. So I don't know if that fully answers your question of how we got into exploring, but it's just so fun. And I think that the exploration or the nursery is kind of like it's like how we were justifying our exploration obsession.
Oh, I love that.
I'd say, but
Yeah. Well, it's just the need is so great, and I think in a lot of ways we kind of bit off more than we can chew, but it's also a beautiful problem to have so many trees. But it is a lot of work to it's kind of easy to get them going, and then they keep getting bigger, and then it's like, oh my God, what are we going to do with these? So so yeah, we're definitely learning and navigating, because it's hard to do everything. The tree search, the exploration, the crop development, the breeding, and then also operating a nursery. And
an oil pressing cooperative, or I guess tree crop processing cooperative.
yeah, one thing leads to another. And yeah, trying to kind of do less and also do more, or do more by doing less or taking on less. So, but the real opportunity is that we need to figure out how to just, yeah, get more people involved. And the context is hard because of, um, yeah, just the economics of it, and just how to restore culture that was lost and just life ways that have been forgotten. So there's an element of, yeah, rediscovering something that is ancient, but it's also something that's forgotten, that is the future. So there's this interesting deep time or temporal aspect to it that kind of feels like a bit of a myth or a prophecy in some ways, of this return to something, um, that is this more complete picture of what it is to be human.
Mm. Oh, I love it. And I think that it's always really inspiring talking to folks like yourselves that have taken this thing that they just really love and just like leaned in, like just really leaned in. And, now you've built all this expertise and are also like giving so much back in helping, sort of like build out the knowledge base, but also supporting yourself. So I just feel like I don't know, I just love it. But I did, folks, I closed the Q&A because we got to get through these, and you can't keep adding all day. We're never going to get through them. So sorry, I closed it up. So let's since you were just talking about nursery, I have another nursery question that popped up. Could you speak to what you see in terms of nursery demand for the crops that you work with? Do you feel that nurseries are meeting current demand?
Um, there's a lot of different factors at play there. There's kind of this really loud call for like, we don't have enough trees, we don't have enough trees. And simultaneously just what seems like a mismatch of high demand, but not a communication in the right advanced time period for people to be able to, in our case, I guess, collect the seed, but get seed, grow them out for a year or two before they're needed, where they're needed, with the right adaptable genetics. So is nursery production meeting current demand? I think it really depends on what species. I think a lot of conservation efforts are saying no, not even close. There's in New York State like a 25 million tree initiative, and they're like, we don't have a tiny percent of that. Um, I think there's it's hard to pick an exact like point in time. I think that there's in this moment a lot of chestnuts being produced like for in the nursery trade, and maybe more so than are being planted in this moment, but maybe in the next few years there's going to be need to be a lot more. I think for us personally, um, we're only just starting to kind of open ourselves up a little bit more as a nursery to broader public. We're really relationship centered. We want to like not just, send some trees out. We want to like know who these people are and what their values are and how they're tending to their trees. And because these are like our babies. Uh, and so um, we're starting to shift to a little bit more openness, though we still want to be able to know about these people. So I guess for us personally, we haven't really explored to the full extent of like uh, we have maybe 100,000 trees that we're looking out over right now in the nursery that you saw here. Um, and we have not sold all of them, but we're selling, I'd say, most of them in the time period that we want to, which I think is a pretty healthy match when you're doing it organically, because we don't know how many will get eaten by voles, or we want to sell just really the top percentage of what we have, so they're just going into the right place in a really healthy way. Um, yeah, I'd say that there's a whole group as far as the Savannah Institute's offshoot of just like I forget what it's called in this moment, the agroforestry working groups, and they talk a lot about the mismatch of, or I haven't actually gone to their Zoom calls yet, but read some of their notes and talk about the mismatch of yeah, getting the right trees produced in the right timelines for the right people is just a real challenge. So I think there's room for a lot more nurseries, particularly ones that are focused on improved seedlings for agroforestry and multifunctional conservation. Um, so, but it's hard to anticipate when those arcs of higher demand are, but that's something that I think gets clearer with more relationships and planning ahead of time.
Agreed. And Stasha dropped the link to the Agroforestry Coalition working groups into the chat. So that's a great resource and something that anyone is free to participate in if they have time and space for that. And there is a nursery specific group. Um, okay, an oak question. Are you familiar with the Bucks Unlimited oak? A precocious and heavy, consistent bearing, I see you nodding, swamp white oak developed at MU Center for Agroforestry.
Yeah, I mean, that's what beautiful stuff can happen if we just put a teeny bit of our attention and funding towards it. It's like, what was that, like less than, it was seedlings, I think, of a specific parent, and they grafted a handful of them and then take seedlings and found that they're really, precocious and productive. It's like, this is not really complicated. Like, audit a lot of these
Six
species.
individuals that were consistently productive.
It was somewhere under 10, yeah, swamp white oaks that they grafted, and I thought they were all seedlings of the same parent, but I'm not certain about that. I guess regardless, I'm familiar basically with what they've done and just think that we could expand that so significantly. Um, yeah, we planted some of those and want to see which ones are hardy for us, and then cross those with, oak, swamp white like um, Cobb Sweeties #2, which is really low tannin, and Bucks Unlimited is pretty high tannin. There's just, in the oak world, the sky's the limit. Um, so much need for investment and attention and reverence for these beings.
So got a question from Russ Cohen, talking about like referring to the taking of nuts by rodents. Says, I believe that some indigenous people would follow the critters to where they would take the nuts and then help themselves to some of the cashew nuts, leaving some tobacco or other token of gratitude behind. I've also heard of folks deliberately setting out some hollow log or other container near a tree, and then the squirrels will fill that container for them. Do y'all have any experience with any of these strategies?
We have had success in asking the tree spirits where the squirrel caches are. Um, yeah, so 3-inch PVC was what Fred Ashworth of St. Lawrence Nursery up in upstate New York recommended. He said that was the ideal squirrel cache material. Um, we've played around with usually in the fall, like we're just scrambling and like I think that like planning and deploying some squirrel cache tubes or logs would be really nice. And we have seen that that has in limited ways been successful. Um, yeah. Also, eating the squirrels is something that we're leaning into. They're super tasty and they're nowhere near endangered. And I think that yeah, in terms of more intimate relationship with the landscape and with reverence and not in any sort of um yeah, I think that there's some cultural associations that might be able to be changed to really unlock the ability for these trees to um lessen our destruction of elsewhere to provide for our most basic needs.
Yeah. And in the process, create much more habitat for them. And yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So we haven't really actively used the cache, like creating a cache for them method, but we've definitely um, stolen some caches without asking. But I'm looking forward to having more conversation with the squirrels and chipmunks to see if we can collaborate a little bit more in the future.
Yeah. And then Russ just had more of a follow-up comment than a question, but he says, well, he doesn't have a lot of experience with Yellowbud hickory gathering. When he gathers shagbark nuts, doesn't bother to check the trees in the woods, but looks for trees on the edge of roads or fields or in the middle of fields
Definitely.
because they're more heavily bearing and have less rodent pressure because of all the open space. And then if there are multiple trees, like 6 or more together, usually way more nuts than the local rodent population consume. And last but not least, he likes to look for areas where the ground underneath the tree is mown just because it's easier to collect nuts. Do y'all have any tips, tricks, anything you want to add to that?
For collection or just for finding better?
Yeah, just in general. Any of it hit a string that you'd like to resonate with?
Yeah, I'd say probably second to rodent management is, yeah, understory management and just creating a surface that's easy to pick from. Um, so we have a flail mower that we're going to trailer around. Um, and that's super helpful. We've experimented with passive catchment systems to varying degrees of success, either using shade cloth or like old greenhouse plastic. And that has been in one tree in particular was successful. In another one, we just essentially created a feeder
Chipmunk.
for families of chipmunks that I don't know if they left one nut for us.
Yeah, so some very fat chipmunks. I think if it's good understory, the combination of tools of a arborist throw bag, unless it's no rodents, which or few rodents, arborist throw bag if you're coming a little bit early before full drop, but they just started dropping, you can kind of throw it up onto a branch, shake if you kind of tie it around a stick and use it as a pull. And then use a leaf blower, battery powered leaf blower to move the leaves out of the way. And then we like the bag-o-nut, though there's other tools that you can use. That seems like the cheapest and most effective, at least with a pretty decent picking surface. I thought I put in here a video of the bag-o-nut, but I think that I might be hunting for a while if I try
I
to.
bet I can Google that in the background and drop a link for people to
Okay.
if you don't have it real handy.
Yeah. Yeah.
There it is.
We
Oh, there
can
we go.
keep going on to the next subject though while we.
Now
Uh,
this is
yeah, when it's a clear picking surface, like it's just you can't pick up nuts by hand at that speed. I think we spent like an hour on this and got like 30 gallons, which was quite good. You get the point.
okay, I'm gonna keep moving just so we can hit all these. One from Nick Wren. Do you feel more work needs to be done developing demand for Yellowbud oil or developing production capacity? I think both are important, but curious if you see one area lacking more than the other. So developing demand versus developing production capacity.
I'd say production capacity. I think the demand, if we did any degree of marketing, like, yeah, the demand is far outstrips production capacity at this point.
We've had like 4 or 5 people a year tell us that they would take more than what we produced that whole year. So I think that's a pretty easy anecdote without really doing any marketing. I think that developing production capacity would also, and like auditing some of the equipment and people that are more mechanically inclined to make it a little bit more efficient, could drive the cost down, as well as actually all the orchards that are being, planted at this point. But because then half the cost to us is just wanting to have the pickers that we coordinate to have a livable wage. So half the cost of like the product, I think it's maybe over half the cost, is just paying people for the nuts. So I would definitely say it's really strongly weighted towards building production capacity. I think if you can produce an oil that's local, regional, regenerative, and yeah, nutritious and delicious, it's like hard to think about what the upper amounts of that market is, though I'm sure that there's both, because you obviously need to let people know what is being produced in order for them to be able to know what to buy.
And so if someone's interested in doing that, what do you think is like the sort of low end size of like what would be the minimum size for like a meaningful yellow bud, planting for oil production?
We're really trying to learn that, and I don't think I have a good answer. If we were to say that the same prices right now, there's all stacked on all these different assumptions, but um, you know, same prices right now of like roughly $240 a gallon, which is like equivalent to like a pretty, a single source organic olive oil that's decently high end, but not crazy, not there's some that are more expensive in that realm. I'd say if you're at the like 10-acre scale and that stays similar, it might be viable as a primary income, but I really don't know. We kind of shy away from recommending that for people that really need to rely on this for their primary income. And at this point, we're working with, this is Hudson Valley Farm Hub, who's a very well-funded nonprofit, working with Bread Tree, where that's not, they're primarily doing chestnuts, silvopasture, and so they have some leeway to be able to play around on some of their acreage. But given that we have 70 to 80 acres of worth of plantings that are going in this next spring, and it seems like very promising possibilities of getting funding to observe these trees for the next, hopefully 25, 30 years, we're going to learn a lot more soon. But I think if this is what you need for your primary income, uh, start really small and don't expect that, or don't do that. Yeah.
I think that's always a safe response. You know, start small, manage your expectations.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The beautiful thing about Yellowbud is that these trees, well, they do travel in packs, so they do kind of have pockets of more presence, but find the trees and you'll find neighborhoods where there's mature trees on lawn and harvest can be quite efficient. So the beauty of this tree and this crop is that they are widespread already. So yeah, ideally these orchard trials went in a few decades ago and we knew exactly what the economics looked like and had some more answers, but we're just starting that process of getting production systems online in kind of like a experimental way.
Yeah. I think that like 60 gallons an acre is like a pretty conservative estimate for improved genetics intended well. I think if we were to be able to like replicate Paradise's productivity, even if we added like, 15 feet, 15, 20 feet between each canopy, so they're actually getting some sun on the sides, by our rough estimates, it still seems like, it seems like they could maybe produce over 100 gallons an acre. So yeah, we're gonna find out more, and I think that the wild harvest is really helpful. One, because they're already here and we can start building the market and interacting with the trees and find better ones through that process. Um, but yeah, also if anyone wants to, start a business with much less upfront cost, getting some grants on equipment, um, there's a guy in Iowa, Levi Geyer, who's a good friend and collaborator in some of this as well, and he alone by hand picked 1,000 gallons of in husk nuts, but likely to be 65, 70 gallons of oil, and this was like his first year, kind of like giving it a shot. He's a hard worker, but still, there's possibilities. I just wouldn't rely on it.
Awesome. Okay. Last few here. Would you say there is more or less or equal potential for yellow bud as an alley crop for human consumption or for silvopasture for animals? So we're comparing human consumption versus animals. Like where do you see the industry, the burgeoning yellow bud industry heading?
Mhm. I That's a really hard question because it depends on so many different things, what alley crop you have and spacing and yeah, what context you're in and what grazing animals are you doing chickens and only doing a few batches a year, or do you have ruminants where you really can't like let go of a paddock for a certain period of time in the fall to let like have a little bit of a window prior to harvest. Um, I'm interested in exploring both is I guess what I'll say.
The
I'm
follow-up question that I just saw to this, the follow-up comment said, which one do you think is likely to get yellow buds onto farms in a large scale way? If that helps kind of refine.
Yeah, I guess I also don't know the answer to that either, but I have a strong bend. I mean, I think both are really required, alley cropping and silvopasture, and I think we don't really know what their symbiotic virtues are, but they are a deep-rooted species. In some studies, they put them in the top tier of like soil building capacity because they have really high calcium in their leaves. Um, they're not super dense shade, but they're more dense than say a honey locust. I'm really excited to interact, excited on both fronts, but really excited to see how they could be integrated into silvopasture systems as a human food and also the potential for them to be consumed by the animals. But that's just because I'm really fascinated with nutrient cycling and things that approximate more um, yeah, ancient old growth savannas.
Mhm.
The beauty with the hybrids that have lower no astringency is that um, you plant your system and you have that flexibility to um, decide whether or not you're gonna just have it be animals that are eating them, or if the processing equipment comes together, then or ideally in 10, 20 years, there's going to be a lot more regional production so that you can, yeah, it could be more efficient. If you don't have the equipment yourself, there will be an aggregator nearby that you can bring the material to.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's the thing too. You don't need to have the answers. It's a incredibly high value food for either humans or animals. So it's kind of hard to anticipate what the markets are going to be, um, what what the economy is going to be like in 10, 20 years, or if we're going to be more like subsistence, trying to feed ourselves.
Right.
It's hard to know.
Yeah.
I'd
Mm.
say one quick thing that I forgot to say. I know we're already past time, but in terms of comparing an analog, I forgot to mention the like is it National Agricultural Statistics Service on pecans, where there's like tens of thousands of acres, in many different states. And something that's really interesting, you can just look that up, NASS pecan for different years. It's helpful to note the massive variation. And when you see that like Oklahoma, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but are in some years like the average over 10,000, I don't know what these numbers are. Many acres is like 400 or something. And then the average in New Mexico is like over 2,000. You say, why is
Like
it
pounds per acre with
pounds per acre sold? Thank you. Why is this so significantly different? And this is conjecture, but I think it's, and I'm not in any way advocating for bare soil clonal orchards with like a couple different individuals, but just learning from those patterns, it's like improved genetics that don't have as much limited access to water, which doesn't necessarily mean irrigation. You can have different practices to build soil organic matter, which can be significant. Um, and fertility. And it's like, if that can be this huge multiplier of what their productive capacity is, we just haven't even scratched the surface with the species that's been totally culturally neglected. Just wanted to say that.
I love it. Um, Nasia asks if you have recommendations for like record keeping methods for tree cultivation operations.
The answer is no. I think this is really going to be the season where we get our ducks in a row. We've kind of been yeah,
Tons
it's
of
been a lot to get to this point, and I think we've kind of like sprinted out, and now it's going to be kind of like a more of like a reassess and just dial in organizational systems.
we use a lot of
Yeah.
spreadsheets, a lot of notes, a lot of pictures. Um, we have people that thankfully love to be here and help us and are more organizationally inclined than I am, at least. Um, I don't have great recommendations for that.
That's fair. All right. So I want to close out with I was having a little bit of a side thread with Michael Gold during in the background because he had made a comment and I was like, will you phrase this as a question? Because I like the comment. So the original comment was, you have to evaluate tree crops over 15 to 20 years to really know how they respond to extreme weather, deep winter, spring frost freezes, fall frost and freezes, excessively wet, excessive dry, excessive hot, all the things. Only after observing over a couple decades do you really know if they're actually well adapted to a given geographic location. This applies, of course, when you bring in material from germplasms, from other regions. And so I said, hey, I love where you're going with this. Will you make this into a question for me? And said, part of this comment is about part of the comment was like how this work has to be sustained for a long time. And an operation like y'all, with you're evaluating all these trees and you're also planting trees. So you're also going to have to like scale your out evaluation as you go, right? Um, and the reason I wanted to close out with this is because I do think it's important to remember sometimes it's like we're working on tree time. You know, this is not like a 21-day turnaround, quick succession arugula production for the market gardener. Like this is the antithesis to that, right? Is the kind of work that we're in. So let's see, at the end of this wrap up, he said, so it's really a comment, maybe a caution more than a question. If there's a question, it would be how does Yellowbud plan to sustain itself into the future? Like, you know, like, do you have a plan to kind of like scale up with staffing and software and detailed record keeping, or like, what do you see the future being? Like, if you can imagine maybe 10 years from now, what does Yellowbud look like?
That's a great question. And I love just the pragmatism that you're coming to all of this with that comment and inquiry, Mike. So there's a couple different responses I have. One is that we can't maybe name all of them, but there's four different, I guess maybe five or six different really well resourced entities that have caught the bug, are listening, and want to interact and want to fund this work. And so, yes, this has been like a ragtag, teeny little team just trying to squirrel our way into learning anything about the potential viability of these crops. And at this point, it seems really promising that we will get I'm speaking this into existence, but I do think it's really promising that we'll get within the next couple years on the scale of millions of dollars to millions and millions over time to assess these trees over the next at least 25, 30 years. We're being offered payment to write proposals for long-term breeding and observational protocols on all of the plantings that are happening in the next few years. And so, yes, we need to scale the capacity in a really thoughtful way to be able to achieve these goals of knowing, of learning and understanding, or just learning more, being in that pursuit. And I think that it's never felt more promising to get closer to more understanding of these sometimes simplest questions that are the hardest to answer. And so that's kind of some of the capacity thing. We are not doing this alone. We mentioned kind of conservation districts. There's a few that we work with directly that are, have already got grants to be doing things like, the couple districts that I mentioned in Vermont just got a grant a little bit ago to start this thing called Farm Force, where they're centering around, active engagement of young people they're getting paid to get trained, not only in like NRCS planning and stuff like that, but also working with tree crops and learning how to evaluate and nursery propagation and all these other things. There's a whole constellation of people in this network that we haven't even like touched on that are starting to collectively build capacity and take on their own little manifestations and iterations of what we're talking about here. So it's really not at all just us at this point. Maybe the node of it started with Sam Thayer as part of like the post-colonial Renaissance. And then there's like an early wave, and then now more of like a much bigger wave. And hopefully in the next, 5-10 years, the animistic, altruistic tsunami of capacity and observation and further planting in context that makes sense, not for farmers that like, we're making any silly promises that we can't keep down the line. And so I think that's one way that we're approaching it. There's also funding that we got, which we didn't really talk about, for a whole mapping protocol that's going to help with assessments, which is in its like infant stage right now, of like a predictive heat map, but we're likely to get approved on a second layer of funding for the state of New York to do something. This is like Western New York areas that, input all this known positive, known negatives, phenology, and a bunch of different characteristics to pump out this kind of heat map. But the stage two of it is like a much more complex situation where we're told that when this map gets created, they can eventually identify, and in not a very long time horizon, we think won't necessarily be perfect, but identify every individual Caryophyllum in the state of New York, and not just a point in the center of the canopy, but draw a perimeter around the canopy. And so with a user interface that's being built side by side, you can kind of go on this web browser and say, like, show me every tree above 50 feet with a clear picking surface in my county. And so kind of trying to break down the barriers of, and you can go up to it and there's maybe some like key identifying features and you can confirm and deny. And so, and then do a lot of data collection on response to, their phenology or response to different aberrant weather patterns, and how that maybe there's patterns that we can draw with, different soil and climatic conditions. So there is so much more interest, funding, community possibility that is coming with this. We're just kind of, speaking to the early happenings of it.
Yeah, the goal for the map interface is more of like a citizen science crowdsourcing of not only observing the trees and validating the predictive map. It kind of makes the harvest more efficient. It makes the observation of the traits and the identification of the exceptional trees more streamlined. And the ethos of it is that it's the food of the people and it's not like privatizing genetics, and just this whole idea of like what is something that isn't commodification, but it is like an adoption or a recognition of a regional staple fat. And not only just for the species of hickory, but for shagbark and the acorns and walnuts. It's this idea of we are living on the garden planet. Our forests are full of food. What happens when we don't draw imaginary lines around the pieces of land where food comes from? And it's this whole different idea of how we're stewarding the land. And
Yeah. And
yeah.
part of that is kind of like how we're building a folders of open source tools that we're going to offer to conservation districts and nonprofits or just the public. We're not kind of like, there's certain forms of entities that we feel more and less drawn to working with, but this is all coming from this place of like, how do we make food more healthy, nutritious food that is in harmony with the land, like actually a human right. And so part of that is like building these open source folders of what we've learned so far. And when we get funding, making sure that or as we get more and more funding, we've already gotten a bit, making sure that the language is structured such that we can like continue with that ethos so that we can invite in a constellation of preferably regionally owned and operated, like decentralized network of processing hubs that come with this ability to find where the trees are and know how to observe them. But we don't know all of how that's going to look yet. We're just like in that pursuit of learning, being in relationship, and trying to really just like pragmatically understand more of what the possibility is when we're in symbiosis here with these trees, or in pursuit of that.
Well, on that charismatic note, I want to say thank you, Jesse, and thank you, Eric, so much for being here and sharing all of your amazing knowledge. If people want to reach out to you, is the best way to do that through your, like the contact form on your website?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thank you to everybody who's here today. I know this is like an epically long episode session of Ask an Agroforester. And again, thank you so much for being so generous with your time. Thanks everybody for tuning in on this Friday. I hope that you're coasting into a wonderful weekend and that this feels like a good way to cap it off. I know that I'm ready to go take a walk in the woods and look at some bark and ruminate. So thanks, everybody. We'll see y'all next time. Don't forget to join us Monday. And yeah, thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks, everybody.